Hello, and welcome to this video lecture on information security management. Today we'll be looking at an overview of the major components of an information system's security. One of the first things that this chapter shows you is how do people record the security in a database for different people. And so what we've got here is an entity relationship diagram. And this is the same relationship diagram that you see in your Access database. And so here we have this entity, a person, place, or thing, and this happens to be a table named person. And you can see what the field names are. And then what you need to realize is that you see all these tables with two little keys in them. Those are primary keys set on two different fields. And when you see something like that, it typically means that this is an intermediate table connecting two outside tables, and that the relationship between those two is a one-to-many. So a person could be in many health clubs. A health club could have many people. Same thing here for an employer, could have many people. A people could be employed by different employers. But this intermediate table then provides that link and any other information that you'd have to know, both pieces of information, in order to get to. And so in this chapter, it tells you that this person policy statement field is where their credentials are stored in terms of what they can do security-wise. And so depending on the type of system you set up, all this information and what people can get to will be stored in a database somewhere. And then you have to have some kind of security in place so that someone can't get into this database and manipulate the data that's in this table, giving themselves or someone else access to information that they shouldn't have access to. So as we go through this chapter, we're going to try and answer the following questions. So what is the goal of information security? How big is the computer security problem? How you should respond to security threats from a manager's perspective? How should the organization respond to those threats? What are some technical safeguards that you can use to protect yourself against those threats? What are some data safeguards to protect against those threats? And then also some human safeguards to protect against those threats. And then how do you respond to a security incident? And then overall, then think about all the security information that you're learning and how is it going to help you in your career or even applying for a job. And so let's go ahead and get started. There's a lot of information to cover out of this chapter. So here's a visual of what our goal of the information security system should be. So we have different threats that are coming in from anywhere. And so a threat can be thought of as a person or an organization that seeks to get data or other assets illegally. That is, without your permission and often without your knowledge of it happening. And so, these sort of things happen all the time. Organizations may not be aware of it, and they may not be aware of it for years later. And so later on, we'll be talking about, so then what do you do if you find out that something happened a couple of years ago? Do you report it to your customers or to the people who had their data violated? And I think the right thing to do is that you need to report it. Because if it should get out, then you're going to lose trust with those stakeholders, entities that are involved with your organization, and see that you didn't protect their data very well. So anyhow, so these threats come in, and then they come in a location where there is a vulnerability. And so that's a place where someone can gain access to your individual or organizational assets. And so an example might be when you buy online, you give out a data card, or credit card rather, and then the data is transmitted over the internet. It then becomes vulnerable to threats. And so if somebody's listening on that network, they can then try and see if they can get your credit card, especially if the information isn't encrypted. That is, it's got some extra characters in there, and you have to have a key in order to decrypt it. We'll talk more about that later. But then we have these safeguards that organizations can put in place, and they try and block the threat so that they can't get to these assets. And so they may or may not be effective. Sometimes people can go around them, they can go through them, and so then they're eventually after this target here, which is the asset desired by these threats over here. So if you're not into graphical forms of learning this, then you might think of this as a table. So here's an example of some different threats. A hacker wants to steal your bank login credentials. So what do? Is they create a site, a phishing site, that looks like the bank site, so that when you try and log in, you will give them your information or credentials for logging in. Right? So one safeguard is that you should only look for sites that are secure, and you know that by looking at the protocol that's at the top in the little address box. So this little S after HTTP gives you a sense that it is secure, and it is secure to an extent. It's not to say that it's 100% secure. So if that regular site is encrypting it, then they can't get to the information, so there would be no loss. Otherwise, there is no safeguard, then you lose that somebody gets those credentials. So that's not a good safeguard, and doing this encryption safeguard would be good. Another problem you may run into is when an employee posts sensitive data to public sites. So this might be Google Group, Facebook, so on. And so what you might have there is in terms of a safeguard is have some passwords and procedures that employees have to go through, and then also some training so that they would know not to do that. But if they do that, then there's loss of that sensitive data that's being posted out there, and that's not a very good safeguard then if they can just go ahead and post the data. So one big area of security is to make sure your employees are trained and that they're aware of what the policies are in terms of posting information about the company on different websites, different social media sites, if you will. So the next thing we want to talk about are what are some sources of threats that you should be aware of. One is human errors. That is, the employee doesn't really understand the procedures and accidentally does something to the data. So they may delete data, they may change the data accidentally, especially if it's like a drop-down box that they're working with and they just accidentally change it. Also, somebody could install an old version of a database on top of the current version. So that way you've ruined all the current data and now you've got to go back and recreate that. There's also computer crime that people can do. That is, there's an intentional destruction of the or theft of the data. And then there's also natural disasters that you need to be aware of and take protections in terms of if this should happen to you, what are you going to do? And so those natural disasters include fires, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, avalanches, and other things that might occur in nature. And so as you look at this, so you've got the human error kind, the computer crime time, and the natural disasters. And so you need, for the natural disasters, you need to have some sort of backup, maybe some off-site backup or off-site handling of your data in case you get hit by one of these natural disasters. Can you get your computers back up and running again? In terms of computer crime, hopefully you all know what phishing is. When you get an email and it's not from the right person, they're actually trying to fish you into providing some information that allows them to get access to the data. In terms of spoofing, when they spoof another website and they make it look like the one you're logging into, but it's really a fake one where they can collect that information. There's also sniffing. That is, they're sniffing the packets that are coming across the network. And then there's hacking, where somebody's trying to physically break into your network system. One other thing you may not be aware of is this denial of service attack. And what this is that when a database is taking an order, right, they put in the information that may have to do some processing before it actually gets saved into the database. Well, if all of a sudden there's a lot of requests for that database to do something from different users, then it becomes overwhelmed and it'll shut down. It uses up all its resources like RAM, and it shuts down and it no longer functions. Well, what people are doing with these devices that are all connected on the internet, they can actually send out a request to a server from those devices and create a denial of service attack. And so if I wanted to target, say, Walmart stores, I could try and create a denial of service attack on them that would shut their computer systems down until they rebooted, refixed, and as long as those bots were still doing the request, then they would go through another denial of service attack unless they prevented it somehow. So then these are all what we would consider, common threats that you might get exposed to that are associated with unauthorized data disclosure. So that is, people don't want to give up this information, but they were tricked into it somehow to give it up. Something you may not be familiar with are the drive-by sniffers. People are looking in neighborhoods to try and get into somebody's network. They're also associated with war driving, and you can have a laptop with a Wi-Fi connection and be going around trying to find free access. Once you're in, you can try and break into their system and grab information off of their computers. In terms of incorrect data modification, you might have procedures that are incorrectly designed or not followed. So you might have something where people are supposed to change their password every 6 weeks. You got to make sure they do it. You need to send out something to test them. If you have a policy that people shouldn't click on links from email accounts that they're not familiar with, you need to train them and then also test them to make sure that that's exactly what's happening. So some other things that could happen is that somebody gets into your system and gives an incorrect discount for a customer or modifies employee salary. If that's in the database, then all of a sudden you're paying somebody way too much, or you're giving way too much in discounts to a customer. They could break in and get onto your website and place incorrect data on your website. It might be your pricing data of your different things you're trying to sell. You could also get in and have system errors. also, with this incorrect data modification, what happens if you didn't test your disaster recovery process? And this has happened numerous times. I can remember an example when someone told me they were working in a doctor's office. They backed up their systems, every Friday night, but after a couple of years they had a disaster, and they tried to restore some of the tapes, and none of the tapes would restore because they never tried to make sure that the tapes that they were making as backups worked. And so you actually have to go in there and make sure that your disaster recovery is working and that whatever you're doing is saving the correct information. Another type of error that you might get is something called faulty service. And this comes from incorrect system operation. So here at the bottom you see we have usurpation. This occurs when somebody who's trying to break into your computer replaces legitimate programs with their own unauthorized one. And it could shut down your legitimate application, or be a keylogger that actually, when somebody's using that application, it's recording all the keystrokes, and they have a way to then steal the data. I talked about the denial of service. Denial of service attacks then is intentional. This one would be unintentional in terms of it's not really an attack. Maybe somebody accidentally shuts down the web server or router, and they're not providing service anymore, but it wasn't intentional. Somebody didn't mean to actually shut the server down. Other problems you might run into is this loss of infrastructure. Here, this is where you might have human accidents. Example might be a bulldozer that cuts a fiber optic line, or somebody that's cleaning the floor and they've got a buffer and they crash into a rack of servers, which then shuts everything down. You can also have terrorist events. Be on the lookout for disgruntled or terminated employees. They may leave behind software that'll destroy other software or other databases in a future time. Again, those natural disasters can come in and wipe you out. There's also something called an advanced persistent threat. This might be a group of individuals that are located anywhere in the world. This example of APT1 was based in Shanghai, and they were stealing information from U.S. firms. So the U.S. Department of Justice actually indicted these individuals. And so you may have something like that happen to your company. So then you need to ask yourself, okay, how do I become more secure? And so there is a trade-off between the risk of loss and the cost of implementing these safeguards. And that is, do you want to make it so difficult it becomes hard for the user to use their computer, takes longer for them to get things done, and so on? And so examples might be to use an antivirus software. Well, this may prevent some software packages from installing properly, so you got to disable it, install the software, and then enable the antivirus software again. It also slows down your computer again if you're checking everything in the computer. But most people, including myself, are willing to have that as a trade-off. Do you delete your browser cookies so people can't get in there and try and figure out what information's being kept there? Again, it'll make your computer a little bit more difficult to use, but is it worth it? But you have to think about, you want some sort of security, but how much security are you willing to put up with in order to make it useful, but not so hard and difficult that people don't want to use it, and then you become really vulnerable to attacks because they're not using any form of security. And I'm going to stop there, and when we come back, we'll start on question 2, that is how big is the computer security problem?